Welcome to the Dynamics of Everyday Life, where we demystify some tricky concepts and get to know ourselves a little bit better. Welcome back to the Dynamics of Everyday Life. At the time of writing and producing this episode, it's at that point in the year when a new academic cycle is starting. Everyone's talking about the back-to-school atmosphere, which brings up some good and some not so good feelings for people. But alongside these feelings of new beginnings, there's also a lot of advice being given, ranging from support for students going off to university for the first time, all the way along the spectrum to parents who are anxiously waving their children into school for their first day. There's so much advice out there, and not just for this. Yes, students will find their mentors and their tutors, and school children will have their teachers to look to. But it doesn't stop there. We're surrounded by experts and influencers who seem to promise us the holy grail of advice, and in a world where many of us are time poor, it's incredibly tempting to think that someone else has all the answers. So the question is, with all this information out there, how do I choose who to listen to? When I was considering what to include in this episode, one thing that was coming up for me was the idea that no one knows us better than ourselves. This is true, to a certain extent. Whilst we do know ourselves in some ways, there are other ways that we are incredibly blind. Margaret Heffernan's 2011 book, Wilful, Blindness, explores the idea that we consciously ignore things that we don't want to see, because they conflict with our current ideology, our plans and our desires. These can be facts about the world and our environment, and also things about ourselves. They get in the way of what we think we want and our direction, sometimes at huge cost to other people and ourselves. Hopefully you've started to get your defence mechanism bingo card at the ready, because in thinking about how we choose who to listen to, we can start to see that we might have some defensive behaviours popping up, and these might mean that we might not always be our best guides. Let's have a think about this with an example. Let's say that I've had a huge row with my brother, and we're both a bit in the right and a bit in the wrong. My brother and I generally get on well, but on this occasion the fur has flown, we have both said exactly what we think about each other on the worst possible day, probably made a few things up as well, and have blocked each other on social media. There's going to be an awful lot of dynamics swirling around in the mix for me here, nicely highlighted as he's a family member. This is not a situation that I'd want to continue, and not just because he manages my IT setup for me. Does it make sense for me to listen to myself here? Maybe a little bit, because there's probably some stuff that I've got right. But let's not forget all the defences that this will have kicked up. We've got our old friend denial, the one where we refuse to believe something isn't true, despite there being overwhelming evidence and facts to say that it is. It can be hard to hear something that we really don't want to believe is true. So our unconscious gets busy by pushing all those facts into the part of our minds where we don't have access to them consciously. And as if by magic, our version becomes our reality. So in the example of the argument with my brother, I am going to deny anything that he said actually has any merit to it, even if he's correct in a lot of what he's saying. This isn't helpful to me here, as I'm not able to look at the situation for what it is. We can see some rationalisation coming in here too. I can give myself all kinds of rational arguments as to why I might be in the right, why what I said and did was perfectly acceptable. This is a way of me making sense to myself of what I've said and done. I give myself a reason, and maybe some permission as to my behaviour. The reason that I'm doing this is because I don't want to consciously accept that perhaps some of my behaviour, thoughts and actions have any bearing on the situation. I don't want to take any responsibility for what's happened. Because if I accept my part in the situation, then perhaps I have to accept some truths about myself that I don't want to look at. These are going to cause me anxiety, and the mind will do whatever it can to avoid feeling anxious wherever possible. There's also the likelihood of some projection creeping in here too. Remember that projection is where we split off parts of ourselves that we don't like very much and locate them in other people. In this example, I might have really shouted at my brother, and unconsciously I don't like this part of myself. So what I do instead is to decide that my brother is the one who's been shouting at me, and I feel very aggrieved, hurt and put out that I feel that I was shouted at. So looking at everything that's happening in this situation, would it be ideal for me to listen to myself without any inside input? Well, if I want to build some bridges with my brother, no, probably not, as I'm not looking at things objectively. I'm only seeing things from my perspective. If I don't want to make things better, then I should just carry on regardless, but that's not going to make for a happy Christmas lunch this year. What could I do to make things better? We all love a quick fix, and it would be great if I could visit an all-seeing, all-hearing wise guru for the perfect answers, a bit like Marjory the trash heap from Fraggle Rock, but that's not an option. So this is probably the time when I start to think about looking to other people for advice or to bounce some ideas off. We might think it would be lovely to be told what to do. As a coach, one of the things that I tell my clients from the very start is that I won't tell them what to do, as I'm really not the expert in their lives. I might make some observations on what I see, maybe some repeating patterns or things that are being avoided, but I categorically will not tell anyone what to do. On the other side, have a think about how you feel when someone tells you what to do, especially if you haven't sought their advice or opinion. Chances are you'll want to do the exact opposite of what they've suggested. Whilst we might like the idea of giving up the responsibility of decision making, in reality that's not what we want at all. We do want some autonomy and power in our decision making. In the example of the argument with my brother, if I discuss this with my parents and they tell me they think I should make up with him, even if objectively I really should, I am absolutely not going to do this because I've been told to do it. I talk a lot on the podcast about self-awareness and how I believe it's fundamental to us leading happier and more fulfilled lives. None of us are ever going to be fully self-aware. It's something we're always going to be learning more about and developing as we go through our lives. So the key thing to consider when we're looking at who to listen to is, how self-aware is this person? Are they aware that they have blind spots themselves, or do they think that they're perfect? Slight spoiler here, no one's perfect. Do they know themselves well enough to appreciate how someone else might think? Do they understand that we're all different, and it might not be that you want advice, you want someone to hold a mirror up to your behaviour? And you might not know this consciously either. Just because you respect and admire someone doesn't mean to say that they're the right person to talk to in this instance. Another point to consider is that not everyone will have your best interests at heart. Sometimes people like hearing about other people's misfortunes because it makes them feel better about themselves. Or it might be that some people's lives are not that interesting, so a bit of drama in someone else's livens their day up no end. We're all complicated human beings, and the version that we present of ourselves to the world is not necessarily who we really are. There's the old saying, don't meet your heroes as you'll be disappointed, for this very reason. Although when I met Roger Moore, I wasn't disappointed, as I've never met anyone with such charisma. Anyway, I digress. My final point of theory to bring in is around transference. If we're looking to other people for advice, it's worth considering if you're entering a transference dynamic. And if you are, is that going to work for you? When we talked about transference previously, I mentioned my positive transference to my mentor for my MCC accreditation and how this worked well. He was the right person to listen to in that situation, and the positive transference that I had here helped. However, if you're looking for advice and it ends up being a negative transference, you're repeating an unhelpful relationship from your primary years, seeking to fix something from years ago, chances are it's not going to end well. You're likely to be disappointed in getting the response you'd hoped for. My invitation for you this week is for you to consider who is on your team and who do you go to for advice when you need it. Consider your intentions when you go to certain people for advice. Do you want their advice, or is it something else you're looking for? Remember that everyone on your team does not need to be there for every situation that you're going to need support with. In the example that I gave about the argument with my brother, I'm not going to discuss it with my osteopath, as important as he is to me, because that's not what he's there for. I'm going to talk to my inner circle, my friends and family who know me well enough to understand when to tell me that I'm being a princess and should apologise, and when to stand my ground. The people that are able to tell me the truth without me feeling that the world is going to end. Because these are the people who are able to help me listen to all parts of myself and then come to a decision. Looking at ourselves at this level can be challenging and unnerving as we develop our awareness, so I'd always encourage that you do this at your own speed. If you feel you need some extra help around this, then I've put together a PDF resource sheet and you can find the link for this in the show notes. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Dynamics of Everyday Life. Please hit the follow button for future episodes and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow me on Instagram at The Dynamics of Everyday Life or find me on LinkedIn at Julia Rogers. I'd love to hear from you and hear your thoughts on dynamics. The Dynamics of Everyday Life is brought to you by Coaching 42 and the fabulous team at the Podcast Boutique.